Yes, tonight's share is dedicated for Binyamin Yisroel ben Chanita, that he should have a Refuah Shelema, b'toch shar cholei Yisroel, and all of the derech Torah that we are saying tonight should be for the benefit of his Refuah and the benefit of all cholei Yisroel, and indeed those who are healthy should also have the zechus of not getting ill. Again, I appreciate the people that are coming, and good evening. And tonight we will be talking about the Parashat Hashavua, the Parsha of the upcoming Shabbos, which is Vayishlach. But at the end, we're going to segue a little bit into Hanukkah, and then, God willing, next week we will talk almost exclusively about Hanukkah. Parshas Vayishlach, the last week's Parsha, Parshas Vayetze, was an action-filled Parsha. Yaakov goes to Lavan's house. He's there for 20 years. He marries his 4 wives, Rachel, Leah, and their maidservants, Bilhah and Zilpah. He has 11 of his 12 children. The last one, Binyamin, is born only when he gets back. 11 of his 12 boys, I should say. He also had a daughter, Dinah, and according to rabbinic tradition, each Shevet also had a twin sister that was born with them, although that is not specifically there. The Parsha recounts the birth of the tribes. It recounts the difficulties in Yaakov's marriage, the fact that he had to work 7 years thinking he'll get Rachel, and then he gets Leah, and then he has to work another 7 years for Rachel, and then the various cheatings and strategies that Lavan employed to deprive Yaakov of wealth, and the miracles that God did to give Yaakov an increase in wealth. So a lot of things are happening. When you read Parshas Vayetze, you're out of breath. But finally, at the end of the Parsha, Yaakov is finally given the green light to return to eretz Yisrael, return to the land that he always yearned to be connected to. Indeed, there's a very interesting drasha Chazal have, that when he sends a message to Esav, because he hears that Esav wants to kill him, and he sends a message with gifts. So he says the Lashon, Im Lavan Garti, I was dwelling with Lavan for all of these years. Garti, I was dwelling, has the same letters as Taryag, 613. And Yaakov is essentially telling Esav that all of the years in Lavan's house, I kept the 613 commandments. Im Lavan Garti, Taryag mitzvot, shamarti. That's a very, very famous drasha that Rashi brings. But the Chassam Sofer asks Akasha that there is a well-known Ramban that says that the Avos kept the Torah even before it was given. They knew intuitively what the commandments were, but they only kept the Torah when they were in the land of Israel. When they were not in the land of Israel, because of the holiness of the land, they did not feel it necessary to keep the Torah. In fact, this is Ramban's answer to a famous question. If the Avos kept the whole Torah before it was given, well, one of the prohibitions in Leviticus is that a man is not allowed to marry 2 sisters. Polygamy was permitted, indeed. Polygamy the Torah does permit, but the Torah does not allow you to marry 2 sisters. So how could Yaakov marry Rachel and Leah? And you can't give me the answer, it is before the Torah was given, because the Avos kept the Torah even before it was given. So the Ramban's famous answer is that the Avos kept the whole Torah only when they were dwelling in the land of Israel, and since Yaakov married Rachel and Leah outside of eretz Yisrael, he was permitted to do so, and that's one of the reasons why Rachel dies shortly after they return to eretz Yisrael, because at that point he's not supposed to have 2 sisters as a wife. Now, there are other answers to that question, and that's not the subject I want to talk about tonight, but the Chassam Sofer says, according to the Ramban, how will the Ramban explain Yaakov's statement that I kept the 613 mitzvos when I was in Lavan's house? He obviously did not keep the 613 mitzvos when he was in Lavan's house. The proof is, he married 2 sisters, and he was not in the land of Israel. So here the Chassam Sofer says a beautiful, beautiful thought. He says, maybe we're mistranslating the word shamarti. We translated it as, I observed them, I kept them. But there might be an alternative translation. We're going to read in a few weeks that when Yosef had all sorts of dreams of the stars bowing down to him and the sheaves of grain bowing down to him, His brothers were very angry at him and they were jealous and they hated him because of it. But the pasuk says, Aviv, his father, Shamar es hadavar. He kept that message in his mind and in his heart. Rashi says, Shamar means Yoshev umitzapeh matai yitkaimu. He was sitting and waiting and hoping and yearning. When will Yosef be raised to a position of greatness? So in other words, the verb shemirah, the verb shamor, does not have to mean you're observing something. It refers to a certain attitude of hope and expectation. So the Chassam Sofer says, we can plug in that definition to Yaakov's statement, Taryag mitzvos shamarti. Meaning, yeah, I wasn't keeping all the mitzvos. I wasn't in the land of Israel. But every single minute of my stay in Chutz La'aretz, I was yearning for when I could return to this land. And this, I'm speaking, of course, Baruch Hashem, from Yerushalayim, and I'm not sure if people hear this Chutz La'aretz, but this, I think, is especially an important message for those who are not yet here, those who are in Chutz La'aretz. And again, a person may have very legitimate reasons. I'm not questioning the reasons of anyone who is not able to be here. But one should know that even if for whatever reason you're not able to be in Eretz Yisrael, and of course because of COVID you can't even travel here really, but every moment one should be Yoshev u'mitzapeh, eagerly waiting and hoping, when will I have the chance? Maybe it'll be when Mashiach comes, and then I'm yearning for Mashiach, as we all should anyway. But the point basically is, wherever your guf is physically situated, your heart and your soul should be connected to this land and to this place. And this, of course, echoes the famous words of the great poet Yehuda Halevi, who spent most of his life in Spain. And according to legend, and it may be a legend, he finally got to Eretz Yisrael and he was murdered by an Arab horseman right in front of the gates of Jerusalem. This is an old tradition that we have. And his famous words are, Libi b'mizrach. My heart belongs to the east, belongs to Eretz Yisrael, even though my guf is b'marav, even though my body is to the west in Spain, whatever it would be. And this is what Yaakov is saying. Now, that's really only part of the sentence. The way Rashi gives the whole sentence, Im Lavan Garti, I lived with Lavan, Taryag mitzvos shamarti, I kept the 613 mitzvos, V'lo lamadati, this is the next half of the sentence, Lo lamadati mimasav hara'im, I did not learn from his evil deeds. So one interpretation is Yaakov is kind of telling Esav, in a bit of a semi-belligerent tone, don't mess with me, even though I'm sending Esav gifts, because I was in a hostile environment, and I was still connected to the holiness of the land, and I didn't learn, I was not influenced by Lavan's evil ways. Therefore, Esav, I have certain spiritual merits that you should not. Again, he's doing it in a very nice way, very gentle way, but he's hinting to Esav that just keep your distance. But I'll tell you a pshat from my own Rosh Hashiva, the Rosh Hashiva of Ner Yisrael, Rabbi Yitzchak Breitowitz, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, in which he says that instead of Yaakov kind of boasting or intimating he has special zechuyot, Yaakov is actually giving musar to himself. Yaakov is saying, I was with this great guy Lavan, this Rasha Lavan, for so long. Why didn't I learn from him? Because there's one thing you can learn from evildoers. They approach their evil with enthusiasm, with geschmack, with passion. Yaakov says, I should approach my mitzvos with the same passion that he approached his cheating. In other words, chaval lo lamadati mimasav haroyim. You have to learn. There are things you can learn even from Rishayim. On one level, of course, you learn what not to do. Okay, that's obvious. But on the other level, You have to kind of take the passion and devotion they have to their perverted causes and apply that passion and devotion to that which is good. And therefore Yaakov is actually giving himself tochacha. Why did I not learn from the evildoers of Lavan? Look at how determined he was. How many times he tried to cheat me. He never gave up, right? He never gave up. And in our ruchnius, in our avodat Hashem, we also need to never give up. But be it as it may, Yaakov is frightened. And the Gemara in Brachos says, although God had made a promise to him in the miracle of the vision of the ladder that we read about last week, but Yaakov is afraid. We discussed this. Shema yigram achatz, perhaps he sins, perhaps he's not worthy of divine mercy. And Yaakov is frightened. And Yaakov develops a number of strategies. Chazal say, Yaakov had 3 plans to protect himself and his family from Esav. First plan is to try to send him gifts, to butter him up, to appeal to his vanity, to kind of acknowledge Esav's superiority on some level, to flatter him. Those are the gifts that he's sending. He sends a lot of gifts. There is a plan B. In the event that Esav is not placated, Yaakov is prepared to go to war. Meaning the initial response is one of reconciliation. If that's not going to work, and Esav is going to try to kill you, you have to fight back. Habar lahargecha, someone who's trying to kill you. Hashkem v'harog lo, kill them first. And then the third thing that Yaakov does, which is really the indispensable element for either course of action, is the idea of prayer. Pray to Hashem. Because without tefillah, nothing works. Without tefillah, anything we do is going to be ineffectual. Yeah, we can't just daven. We need to engage in diplomacy, which is like gift giving, or war if necessary. We have to do that. We need an army. We're not on the madrega where I simply do nothing and say, Hashem, heal me. Hashem, give me parnasa. Hashem, give me security. Give me peace. We don't yet live in that type of world. Tragically, and this goes back to Adam Harishon, the curse, we live in a world where we have to work for our parnasa. We have to seek medical attention for our health. We need to develop a military and a police force. Yes, we need to do that. That is what is called hishtadlus. But we also have to know that at the end of the day, none of that is going to be successful without God. That's why I was so hurt and offended, and I'll judge him l'kaf zechus, by a statement that Governor Cuomo made in New York. Now we know the Jewish community obviously has disagreements with Cuomo about the COVID regulations. Okay, putting that aside, but he made a statement about prayer and this and that. He says, it wasn't God that is reducing the number of sick people in New York. God did not intervene in this one. God let people die. It was our hard work that resulted, first of all, he had nothing to do with the vaccine anyway, but it was our hard work that developed the vaccine. That is again, perhaps he didn't mean what he said, but that is a tremendously arrogant statement. Yeah, a lot of human beings died, and a lot of people worked, endlessly to perfect this vaccine. It's a remarkable triumph, really. And by the way, Trump should get a lot of credit for this. But ultimately, why God didn't allow it to be developed earlier, or why did God allow COVID, I don't know. Why did so many people die of polio or be paralyzed of polio in the 1940s and 50s and before? And why was the vaccine not developed until the late 50s or 60s? I don't know. But the one thing I do know is that if we did achieve a success, and if we did achieve a bracha, and if we did achieve a breakthrough, it is not because God was not involved. It's exactly the opposite. It's because God decided that now is the time that he will bless our efforts with success. And again, the vaccine hasn't been tried yet really, but Bezrat Hashem, it should be successful. So this is what Yaakov is saying. On one hand, when you meet the enemy, there is diplomacy, peace. On the other hand, be ready for war. But know that without prayer, everything is batel umuvutal, everything is nullified. nothing is going to work. You got to pray, you got to daven. They say tzaddikim daven, like, they're going to get a cup of coffee. The tzaddik prays, may I be successful. Like everything, there is nothing for which you don't need Hashem to give you success. Things can change in an instant. In fact, one of the lessons of COVID, and I think we've said this more than once, is that we think we live in a kind of a secure world. But Hashem shows us everything can change on a dime. And you can't depend on anybody and anything. And you need prayer. So the thought that I want to share with you is this. When Chazal would look at Yaakov's encounter with Esav, which actually seemed to end well, right? Esav, who initially wanted to kill him with an army of 400 people, Esav winds up hugging him, kissing him. He wants to travel with Yaakov, and Yaakov figures out an excuse. Maybe not right now. We'll meet later. Rashi says we'll meet when Mashiach comes, and you'll be defeated, etc. But Esav seems to have a change of heart. Yaakov's encounter worked in many, many ways. But when Chazal looked at this, they saw this not only as an isolated story, but they saw this as a prototype of how a Jew relates to a hostile, secular culture that often wants to destroy the Jew. In fact, it is said that whenever the rabbis, whenever the chachamim would have to meet with Roman officials, either the emperor or the governor, the provincial governor in Caesarea, they would always study Parashat Vayishlach, because remember, in rabbinic tradition, Rome is actually considered to be a descendant of Esav. In fact, the Roman exile, which we're still in because we still don't have the temple they destroyed, is called the Galus of Edom, the Galus of Esav. It's an interesting question. One can delve into this a little bit. Is the Chachamim statement accurate in a literal sense? Are the Romans descended from the Edomites? Some say yes, because some identify the Edomites as the Etruscans, who were the ancestral people in Italy before the Romans, and the Romans intermarried and interbred, so there's a lot of Edomite stock in Rome. Others look at it in more of a metaphorical way, that the spiritual negative energy of Rome, Western civilization, comes from the Esav aspect of it. But whatever it is, Chazal did identify Rome as Edom. Edom is the red man, which is, of course, Esav. And whenever they would negotiate with the Romans over the conditions of the Jews in eretz Yisrael, they would always read Parashat Vayishlach to extract lessons as to how you negotiate with a somewhat of a hostile enemy, right? So they saw this as a blueprint, as a prototype for dealing with secular culture. So here I want to suggest in what way that would be the case. And here, let me share with you a thought, and this is where Hanukkah comes in a little bit, from the great Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. A little biography for a moment. Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch was a great 19th century German rabbi, and in the mid and late 19th century, the Reform movement had spread across Germany, literally like a cancer. 100 years before, Germany had been a big Makam Torah. The city of Frankfurt was one of the great Torah communities in Am Yisrael. You had the Pnei Yoshua, one of the great Gedolim, the Chassam Sofer, came from Frankfurt and the like. So it was really a city of Torah. It was like Lakewood, whatever it would be. And yet, in the course of 50 or 60 years, the Reform movement decimated, destroyed religious life in Frankfurt. It's quite amazing how rapidly it spread. In fact, we even have accounts, it's an amazing thing, where a child, and when they became an adult, they were writing about their own parents who were Orthodox, a rabbi and a rebbitzin. The day that they decided to become Reform Jews, and to Salmonize that decision, they said, we're going to go to a treif butcher shop and buy pork. And the child actually describes the story, how the father and the mother were trembling, they were shaking, because they had never had treif in their lives. But they made a decision. They were going to be Reformed Jews. And they walked into the Parsha, almost like, Chas v'shalom, it's almost like they're doing a great mitzvah. They're entering the Holy of Holies. Of course, it's exactly the opposite. And they buy the pork. And the son, it's a very dramatic description. And the son describes how his mother's hand is shaking and shaking and shaking, but she finally ingests it. And suffice it to say, as the son remarks somewhat sarcastically, it was easier the second time. And of course, that's the nature of Averos. So the point you have to know is that Frankfurt, which was one of the great Jewish cities of Am Yisrael, was its religious life was totally destroyed. And not only that, but legally, the Reform movement in Germany got financial control of Jewish institutions, so they controlled a lot of money. The community really couldn't, the few religious Jews who were left couldn't do anything. So there was a group of only 10 religious Jews in Frankfurt. 10, a minyan. And they had the audacity to invite a very prominent rabbi who already was leading large congregations, Rabbi Hirsch. And they asked him if he would become their Rav. Now, if you think about that, that was an absolutely almost idiotic thing to do. It's like asking the Rosh Yeshiva of Panovich or Lakewood or Mir, which has thousands of students, to kind of, hey, I'm starting a group of 5 students, can you become my, why don't you leave Mir and leave Panovich and come to my little yeshiva? It normally doesn't work that way. And yet Rav Hirsch saw this as his life's mission. He saw this as a message from heaven. And he gave up a large and prestigious rabbinate to simply lead a small little congregation. And over the course of almost 50 years, see, we know Rav Hirsch from his wonderful writings that are still studied, but one also has to know what a community builder he was. He built a community into thousands of people, and his message spread throughout Germany. And he was the one who really restored Orthodox Judaism, Torah Judaism, to the decimated German communities. His community in Frankfurt was destroyed in the Holocaust, but it got transplanted, and there's a big German shul and German community in Washington Heights, Upper Manhattan, and that is the successor of Rav Hirsch's shul in Frankfurt. It's the same name, Kahal Adas Yeshurun, which was the name of Rav Hirsch's Kehillah in Frankfurt. Now, the reason I'm bringing this in, and again, I think the biography is helpful to put things in perspective, is Rav Hirsch was universally acknowledged as a great man, a gadol. But he had a philosophy that was somewhat different than the philosophy of the main Torah centers, which were in Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. In Poland, Lithuania, and Russia, the great yeshivos, right, the great yeshivos of Mir, Slobodka, Kamenets, Baranovich, Brisk, Vilna, Minsk, these are the great Torah cities. There was a very strong belief that if you were capable, your life should be devoted exclusively to Torah study. The notion of university, the notion of secular education, was considered to be destructive, worthless, no good, get away from it. We'll call that, superficially, the Torah-only response. Rav Hirsch had a different school of thought. Rav Hirsch developed a philosophy that was called Torah im derech eretz. That means Torah combined with worldly affairs. That's sometimes abbreviated T-I, like tide, T-I-D-E, Torah im derech eretz. And under the Hirschian view, Rav Hirsch did not see secular wisdom as something to reject. Rav Hirsch said that within secular wisdom, whether it's science, mathematics, or even humanities, literature and poetry, there might be very beautiful insights that you can incorporate in your worldview, and that will enrich and deepen your service of God. And instead of rejecting involvement in the world as something that is destructive and negative, Rav Hirsch says you can embrace it and bring it in. Now, Rav Hirsch was very cognizant that there are dangers there. There's much out there that is wrong, that is immoral, that you have to reject. You can't simply have an attitude, I bring in everything. But Rav Hirsch says on a selective basis, and in fact, there are two justifications for this. One is, I can take from that secular world and bring it into my Judaism and enrich it. But then it also works the opposite way. I take my Jewish values and I bring them into my secular life. So when I'm a lawyer, a doctor, an accountant, a businessman, I don't live like a split identity, meaning from 9 to 5, I'm a lawyer, and after 5, I'm a religious Jew. No, I have to be a lawyer in accordance with what a religious Jew is, in terms of my ethics, in terms of my integrity, in terms of the derech eretz I have for everybody I encounter, whether it's my clients, whether it's my competitors, whether it's the other side, whether it's the secretary, whether it's the janitor. You see, there's a double movement here. There's the bringing in of the secular into your Judaism to deepen your understandings, and then there's the bringing of your Jewish values into your secular life. And Rav Hirsch actually held that that was the ultimate realization of the Torah. The ultimate fulfillment of the Torah is not when you separate from the world. It is when you somehow bring the Torah perspective. Because after all, the Torah envisioned a Jewish society in Eretz Yisrael. And in that society you had to have businessmen, lawyers, farmers, accountants, whatever it would be. So obviously the Torah envisions that Jewish people would be involved in all of the activities that modern society needs. And that would change, of course, what those activities are, will change with the time and place. And therefore there has to be a Torah perspective. In fact, this is, as you know, the dominant philosophy of the Haredi world in Israel is totally against this. And as I say, the Eastern European model was also against this. That's why the Gedolim of Eastern Europe had a bit of a problem with Rav Hirsch. They didn't know exactly what to do with Rav Hirsch. On one hand, they admired him. They saw the great work that he did, the great transformation that he effected in Germany. On the other hand, he was espousing a model that they actually rejected. So I don't want to get into all of the technicalities. I just want to point out, as a result, they interpreted Rav Hirsch in a certain way, which is probably not true. They interpreted Rav Hirsch to basically mean, listen, of course this secular stuff is worthless, no good, counterproductive. But Rav Hirsch is dealing with an assimilated, ignorant population. This is the best he could have done. If Rav Hirsch would have started talking about kollel and yeshiva, they would have turned their backs on him. So he had to give them a watered down, kind of almost distorted view of Judaism, because that's the only way he could bring them into the fold. The way this is often expressed is, Torah im derech eretz is a b'di'eved and not a lechatchila, and the lechatchila approach would be the Torah only approach. I just want to point out that that does not seem to be what Rav Hirsch was espousing. Rav Hirsch seems to have been espousing an alternative ideology. But of course, let me emphasize the obvious. Torah im derech eretz does not mean Torah and worldly pursuits are equal partners here. Torah, avodas Hashem, is the dominant goal. And you're simply using the secular world as ways of deepening your understandings on one level, and on the other level, bringing the Torah into those secular pursuits.
Didn't many of the greatest rabbis that ever lived have an occupation, whether it's the Rambam, who was a doctor, Rashi, who made wine, Chaim had a store.
So here you have to differentiate. You get into a lot of subtleties, and that is, if Rav Hirsch's only point was a person should have an occupation, so that already we go back to the Rambam, Parnasa. But Rav Hirsch's idea was you can learn something positive from these chachmas, meaning don't just go to get a job, but in literature there are insights that you can get.
Even from just the Vilna Gaon's example of a master in mathematics, how could you even learn the Torah, whether it's the Gemara, Midrash, whatever it is, without knowing astronomy, without knowing mathematics, without knowing biology?
Yeah, that's a good point. In fact, there is a quote in the name of the Vilna Gaon, who said that for every measure of secular wisdom that you are lacking, there will be 10 times as much Torah that you won't understand. And that's why the Vilna Gaon himself, now the Vilna Gaon is the prototype of what is called the Torah only, right? That the Vilna Gaon learned Torah 18 hours a day. And yet the Vilna Gaon was very, very proficient in science, mathematics, and he actually commissioned his students to translate Euclid's geometry. Euclid, the famous Greek, really founder of geometry, and he commissioned his students to translate Euclid into Hebrew, so that people would be able to read mathematical books. But I still think there's a bit of a difference, because I think the Vilna Gaon would limit this to what you might call objective knowledge, science, mathematics, astronomy. But when it comes to the humanities, he would say that's kind of treif. We only look at Jewish things. We don't look at elsewhere. Now, Rav Hirsch brings a very beautiful source for his philosophy. And that goes back to the story of Noah. And again, I'm going to segue back to Vayishlach. You'll see how all of this will be connected. If you remember, when Noah got drunk after the flood, and his nakedness was exposed, and Ham was mocking his nakedness and calling the brothers over to look at it. So Shem and Yefet, the other two brothers, they draped a blanket over their shoulders, and they walked backwards to cover their father's nakedness without seeing it. Right? The famous. So Noah gave Yefes a bracha. And the bracha that he gave to Yefes was Yaft Elokim liyefes v'yishkon bi'olei Shem. God shall give beauty. It's a pun. Yefes, Yafeh. God shall give beauty to Yefes, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem. Now in English that sounds very bad, but in Hebrew it's not bad at all. The tents of Shem. Shem is a name. So Yefes shall dwell in the tents of Shem. Maybe I'll say Shem instead of Shem. Shem. Now what does that mean? Yefes shall dwell in the tents of Shem. Rav Hirsch says, and this is very, very interesting pshat, that Noah is giving these two sons. Ham is kind of the excluded bad guy, so he's out of the picture. But Mitzrayim comes from Ham, the Canaanites come from Ham. Okay, they're out. But Shem and Yefet are given two missions. Shem is given the mission of spreading godliness into the world. Shem, of course, founded the famous yeshiva of Shem and Aver. Aver was his great-grandson. So Shem's mission is to teach the world what you might call ethical monotheism, holiness, morality, ethics, faith in God, prayer. Shem himself began the implementation of that mission, but the primary bearer of that mission was Shem's descendant, several generations later, Avraham Avinu, and ultimately the Jewish people. We are called Semites. Semites comes from Shem because we are descended from Shem. So Shem is given the mission of ethical monotheism, godliness and holiness. Yefes is given an additional mission, a complementary mission, and that is to generate yofi, to generate beauty in the world. Now remember, one of Yefes's children was Yavan. Yavan means Greece. The ancestor of Greece comes from Yefes. Greek culture, above all, we would describe Greek culture, which was a very, very high culture, as a culture of beauty. And this is true in many, many ways. There is the beauty of sculpture, music, which the Greeks did have, art, poetry, comedy, drama. I'm not sure if the Greeks were into painting. I'm not aware of any paintings from there, but probably there was some type of visual art there too. There is also the beauty of logic, mathematics, philosophy. Again, although many of us are math phobic, but people who are into mathematics often describe it as beautiful, elegant. Right? There's an elegance in mathematics. There is the beauty even of athleticism, the human body. the Olympics, the glorification of what the body can do. So Yavan was a culture of beauty. Intellectual beauty, artistic beauty, athletic beauty. And this came from Noach's bracha. This was a mission. This was a legitimate mission to bring beauty in the world. But what is Noach saying? The beauty of Yefet, which was carried out to his son Yavan, is beautiful, but only when it dwells in the tent of Shem, only when it's subordinate, only when it's mevatel itself to the ethical monotheism of belief in Hashem and submission to morality and ethical constraints. Meaning, when the beauty becomes an end in itself, whether it's physical beauty, intellectual beauty, artistic beauty, athletic beauty, whatever it is, when that is separated from the tents of Shem, and it's no longer seen as something that augments and deepens your service of God, then it becomes corrupt, then it becomes degrading, then it becomes sinful, then it becomes another form of idolatry in which you're trying to create a competition with God. And not only that, it ultimately becomes destructive. In some ways, this is even connected to Nazism. Nazi Germany officially was a Christian country, but not really. The roots of Nazism are in paganism. They employed pagan symbols. Essentially, I mean, God was invoked sometimes just as an aside, but it was not at all connected to the ethical monotheism of Christianity, which in turn is based on Judaism. I know people don't like the expression, but people do it, the Judeo-Christian ethic. That's a very incomplete and misleading phrase, but on one level it is accurate, dignity of man, etc., morality, at least on that level. There is a tzad hashaveh in which Christianity did derive some truths from Judaism, although they were destroyed. In that sense, Nazism was there was a very big glorification of beauty. I mean, if you ever see the pictures of Nazi rallies, kind of very impressive. The flags and the uniforms and the discipline and the dancers and the singers. Yofi. Things were very pretty. I mean, I hate perhaps to describe Nazism that way. But it was a beauty that was totally divorced from any moral vision of submission. In fact, it's so fascinating that Hitler, Yimach Shemo v'Zichro, Hitler had a fairly deep understanding of what Judaism was. He knew a lot more about Judaism than many Jews did. He knew that Judaism limits your power. Judaism says, just because you're strong, you cannot oppress the weak. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you may do something. He understood that the great contribution of Judaism in the world was to put ethical constraints on human autonomy. That's a pretty deep understanding. Of course, he hated that. And that's why he hated Judaism and he hated Christianity. Lahavdil. Because he didn't want limits. He wanted there to be unlimited power. Whatever you can do, you should do. Oppress the weak, conquer their land, take their property. You see, he understood Judaism very well, and he hated it. In fact, a lot of his hatred for the Jewish people is ultimately a hatred of what Judaism represented to the world. And he writes this in Mein Kampf. He's very, very open. I mean, it's an amazing thing. Hitler was thought, before 1933, Hitler was thought to be some isolated lunatic who would never get past dog catcher or whatever it would be. But he wrote in Mein Kampf, when he was a nobody, exactly what he was going to do. And Rachmana litzlan, he did a lot of what he said he was going to do. And this is it. So Rav Hirsch is saying, when we look at what Greek culture represents, aesthetics, beauty, The Torah does not say it's something bad. It is a blessing that Noah gave to Yefet, and it's a mission that Noah gave to Yefet, carried out by Yavan. But it becomes good when it's brought into the tents of Shem. But when it's separated from the tents of Shem, it can actually become a demonic, destructive force. So Rav Hirsch used this verse as the predicate of his philosophy that we can and should embrace what is good in the world, because that is also a blessing of God that can deepen our connection to Him and deepen our service of Him, instead of rejecting everything that is outside of the four walls of the Beit HaMedrash. Now again, Rav Hirsch did make the point over and over again that everything has to be in the service of Hashem and Torah. These are not co-equal things. And Rav Hirsch also acknowledged that there are dangers, that sometimes you might incorporate corrosive, negative elements, which you have to be very vigilant to keep out of your life, keep out of your philosophy, and the like. So based on this, based on Rav Hirsch, I'd like to suggest that maybe these are the three things that Yaakov are doing, that these are metaphors for how you respond to a secular culture, a secular life. Yaakov's encounter with Esav. How do I respond? How do I relate to a culture that is so different than the Torah, that's antagonistic to the Torah? And the suggestion is, you got to incorporate three strategies. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not monochromatic. Giving gifts is a symbol of welcoming, right? When I give you a gift, I'm welcoming you. So strategy one is, be open to the good in these cultures and bring it in. Don't reject everything. Understand, as our sages have said, if someone tells you Chachma b'goyim, that there is wisdom among the nations of the world, Tamin, believe them. Torah, they don't have. But a great deal of wisdom they do have. Many, many examples. Of course, Rabbi Poston mentioned the example of the Rambam learning medicine, the Vilna Gaon with mathematics. But in a more recent example, we have Rav Shlomo Volba, who was a great, great Baal Musar, that at one point when he was a young man, he was stranded in Switzerland during World War II, which Switzerland was a neutral country. So in Switzerland was a fellow, a non-Jewish man, Jean Piaget. Piaget was considered to be the greatest child psychiatrist in the world. He was an expert, and his particular interest was, how do children develop a sense of morality, right and wrong? Right? And that's a very important question, because all of us want to develop in our children a sense of right and wrong. And Rav Volba, who was a student of Musar, which focuses on improving your character, he actually apprenticed himself to Piaget to kind of understand how human beings develop an intuitive sense of morality. Now, Piaget was not based on the Torah in any direct way. He was not Jewish. But Rav Volba thought that from Piaget he could get insights that he would apply in his Musar teachings. Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, Zichrono Livracha, who was a great Rosh Yeshiva in the Dati Leumi world. He was the son-in-law of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. Rav Aaron Lichtenstein was a big Talmid Chacham and a Rosh Yeshiva for many years, but he had a PhD in English literature from Harvard University, and his thesis was about, I believe, connected to John Milton's Paradise Lost. Now, if you know what Paradise Lost is about, I mean, it's essentially a story about the fall of Adam from Gan Eden, but it's really full of Christian imagery. It is really a Christian piece. But he saw that he was able to kind of extract from all of the stuff that we could not accept certain ideas that helped him in his Avodas Hashem. Right, so there is this concept of some things you can welcome, but we then have the second stage, waging war. In other words, metaphorically, what I'm suggesting is, The idea that Yaakov gave gifts and prepared for war expresses exactly the kind of double response we have to have to the culture of the world. There are things we can embrace and things that we have to totally reject. And either response standing alone is not a good response. Because if you have a response, I reject everything, that's secular. Or you have a response, I accept everything that's out there. Either way, you're making a mistake. Now, I will tell you the truth. If you had to make a choice between rejecting everything and accepting everything, rejecting everything is probably a better choice, because accepting everything will poison you so much. Meaning, if I reject everything secular, so I'm limiting myself. My Judaism is not as rich, it's not as deep, it's not as colorful. Okay, but at least I'll be a good Jew. If I accept everything, then I'm going down the rabbit hole, because then abortion, gay rights, I'm okay, you're okay, transgender. In fact, gay rights is it's not even an issue anymore. Now we're talking about transgender, a whole new set of shilas and the like. So I respect a person who basically says, I will try to limit my connection to the secular as much as possible, because frankly, we're afraid. We're afraid that those influences may be poisonous. And that is a real concern. But you need to understand, that's not the optimal Jewish way. That is the lesser of two evils. In other words, I'm going to reject everything because the risks of infiltration are too big. I got it. I respect it. But ultimately, the highest and richest form of avoda is when you can take the good and bring it in, and at the same time repel the negative. And that's the idea of why Yaakov has to engage in the strategy of both milchama, waging war, and giving gifts. To welcome things, to reject things. Now, how do you know what to accept, what to reject? That's step 3. You got to daven. You need a lot of divine assistance. It's not an easy thing to do. And as I say, maybe an individual family might decide that we're not capable of that decision. Again, as I say, if you have to make a choice, that is the better choice to make. If it's neither or decision, it's better to err on the side of rejecting. But at the same time, there's also another element here. Every child is different within a family. Chanoch l'nar al pi darko. A child may have a certain interest in astronomy, in medicine, in science, in math, in poetry, or music. You have to be careful as a pedagogical matter not to shut off those avenues of expression, because that's kind of where his soul is beckoning. You see? So this is why Yaakov employs multiple strategies, because Yaakov is reminding us that our encounter with the world is not a fight or flight choice. It involves an integration, a synthesis, a harmonization. And that's a difficult skill. That takes wisdom, that takes discernment, that takes judgment, and the like. So, we know that Motzei Shabbos, when Shabbos is over, in the Amidah of Arvit, we recite Havdalah. We recite that God separates between the holy and the profane. Now, in which bracha, which blessing of the Amidah is the Havdalah placed? It is placed in the blessing about wisdom and knowledge. So the Gemara asks, why do you put Havdalah in the blessing about wisdom and knowledge? And the Gemara's answer is, because without wisdom and knowledge, a person is not able to make separations. Meaning to be able to discriminate, to be able to identify which is good and which is bad, takes a great deal of wisdom. So sometimes I might have to throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. But that's too bad. I'm losing a baby, right? So it takes a great deal of wisdom. And but I think ultimately this is kind of a mission that we should strive to achieve. Now, the reason I'm connecting this to Hanukkah is the following. and again, I'll continue this next week. The typical understanding of Hanukkah, and this is very important, is that although Hanukkah was a military struggle against Yavan, and that military struggle culminated in political independence of a Jewish state. The Hasmoneans established a Jewish state that lasted for more than 100 years until the Romans came in. So you could look at Hanukkah, but I'm not dealing with the candles tonight, I'm talking about the military victory. You could look at this as kind of a military victory, reestablishing Jewish sovereignty, similar somewhat to the War of Independence in 1948. It was like a revolutionary war to overthrow foreign oppression. You can look at it that way. But it's very clear from the Al Hanisim prayer that we say at Hanukkah that although this was a war for political independence, it was not undertaken for political purposes. It was undertaken to be able to keep the Torah. That Antiochus instituted a policy in which Jews were not allowed to keep mitzvos, and the Hasmoneans fought to throw off the yoke of oppression. Why? Not because they just wanted political independence. They wanted to be able to keep Hashem's Torah, and they were willing to risk their lives to keep the Almighty's Torah. That's why the Al Hanisim emphasizes over and over again that the goal of the Yevanim was lahashkicham Torasecha, to make you forget the Torah, lahaviram, to take you away mechukei ritzonecha, from the laws of God's will. That's very important. Hanukkah was not about political independence. It was about religious ability to keep the Torah. The war was a means to that end. That is why, by the way, the Malchus of the Hashmonaim had kind of a tragic ending, because eventually the Hasmonean kings became persecutors of the Chachamim, and they became the very enemy that they overthrew. It's quite amazing. In fact, it's also such a paradox that, the Israel kind of Olympic analog is called the Maccabee Games. The Maccabees were fighting against all of those elements of Greek culture. So typically what you're going to hear in every yeshiva shmooze, and again it's accurate, I'm not saying it's wrong, is that this was the war against Yavan. Yavan represented the culture that was antagonistic to God. And the Hasmoneans overthrew Yavan. And that of course is true. But the point I want to make is, it is not inevitable that Yavan is totally repudiated. The Yavan that separates from the tents of Shem becomes a destructive evil force that needs to be eliminated. But that doesn't mean we reject the beauty that can be within Yavan. Rather, our goal is to take that beauty and bring it into the tents of Shem and have it augment our connection to Hashem and our Jewish identity.
The menorah in the temple didn't have 8 that had 3 on each side. It was 6.
Yep.
They represent the 6 branches of wisdom.
Yeah, that is absolutely correct. That in the ancient world there was a concept of 6 branches of wisdom. I always forget what they are, but there's mathematics, there's rhetoric, there are different astronomy, there are different types of chachmot. And what's interesting is that all of the wicks of the 6 have to go to the center shaft of the menorah, which represents God and the Torah. Meaning all of the chachmot are useful and good when they are employed in the service of Hashem. So when we talk about Hanukkah as a war against Yavan, you have to redefine it, you have to tweak it a little bit. It's not so much a war against Yavan, it's a war against the Yavan that does not dwell as a subordinate force within the tents of Shem, but when it dwells within the tents of Shem, it then becomes something good and something positive, and our avodat Hashem can be enriched by those insights and by those chachmas. Obviously that's true for hard science, in which astronomy and mathematics are necessary to understand the Torah. But even in elements of humanities, there are certain, like Revolba and Jean Piaget, Dr. Piaget, there are ways we can understand life by looking at the collective wisdom of others. And of course, a very, very current example, we just sniffed her a few weeks ago, I think we already spoke about Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Lord Sachs, Olav Zecher Tzadik L'Bracha, Olav HaShalom, and he of course was an exemplar of the modern example of the person who drew on all of these chachmos to convey the message of Judaism to audiences who would otherwise not understand what that message is. And that's kind of an example and a model for all of us to try to follow in our, albeit in our greatly diminished way. So that was my message for tonight. I actually had more to say, but I'll carry it over to next week. I wish you all a Shavua Tov, and may this Hanukkah, which is upcoming, be a source of great light and redemption, and may it be the light that shines through the deepest and greatest darkness. Thank you.
It's